You are listening to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, brought to you by Community Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida.
Hello and welcome to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Argersinger, and my co-host is Kelly Allen. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Tom. On the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, we explore how we as Jesus followers can connect the dots between education, contemporary culture, and biblical theology and live like Jesus in this broken and challenging world. And we are so excited today because we have Miss Danielle Henn with us.
Woohoo!
Yay!
Welcome, welcome.
Miss Henn, let me tell everybody a little bit about you. You have a history with CCS. You are a CCS alumna. Former CCS elementary art teacher, is that right? And former director of visual arts for Latour.
There you go.
So we are so excited to have you back. You have a Bachelor of Arts in Studio Art from Florida State University, and then you went on to get your Master of Arts from the University of Florida, and now you are a doctoral candidate in art education at Florida State University, and you're set to graduate May 2nd. Is that right?
Yes.
All right.
Congratulations for all your accomplishments.
Absolutely.
And what are you doing these days?
Right now, I teach K-12 art for an online Christian school called E08 Christian Academy.
Awesome.
Very good.
Awesome.
How long you been doing that, Danielle?
Ooh, this is my third year.
Wow.
I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very nice. Good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's just dive right in with our first question for you. When caring for and developing your creative work and creative work of others has profound spiritual impact. So my first question for you is, tell us about the connection between your creative work and your spiritual well-being, because a lot of people don't put those two things together.
That's right.
But it's really important.
Yeah, I think, maybe beginning with a more expanded definition of spiritual well-being or creative work, I think people hear those phrases and think of very specific things like, art on the gallery wall or going to church. And for me, creating and making that creative work of any kind, listening to music, making visual art, sure, but even working together with someone on a project we're trying to problem solve, getting into what Csikszentmihalyi is someone who describes something called the flow state. So anytime I get into that flow state, which I think, Tom, I've heard you talk about improvisational music being something that you feel there's some connection to the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Anytime I enter into that flow state, I am able to draw on, touch back on spiritual truths that that I was fortunate enough to grow up with and learn. But it's kind of the lyric, let thy goodness like a tether bind my wandering heart to thee. I feel like my creative practice is something that no matter how far I think being creative might take me away from the Lord or away from truth or away from beauty, if you're engaging in it truthfully, authentically, rigorously, for me, it always brings me back to faith, to the gospel, to what's true, what's good, what's beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. That's so important. And I think it's a message that's not all that common. I mean, there's like a subset of Christianity today, and there are people talking about this. And we talk a lot about people like Makoto Fujimura and various other people that talk a lot about it, but it's a really small group relative to the whole Christian church. And for most people, they have no idea who these people even are. And so I think these conversations are especially important because it opens up these lanes and these portals, for working with, for example, young people, which is what we do in gospel-centered education. And what you're doing with E08 is to say, there are this creativity connecting to with the students and with the Lord and this kind of beautiful synergy that happens. So what are some ways maybe you think that educators can help nurture that creativity in their students, maybe regardless of what the class is?
Sure. I think listening to and being slow to pass judgment on student interests, things that might at first appear outside of a Christian worldview, or you just don't understand where's the goodness, where's the beauty in this thing, pausing before shutting down whatever that is, and instead asking questions about, I have a friend, for example, who loves the movie The Nightmare Before Christmas, right? Which is like a goth kid standard. The main character is a skeleton. You know, at first it just has these really spooky vibes. But when I asked her, you know, what do you love so much about that movie? She said, well, this one character really functions like the Holy Spirit for the main character. And then proceeded to show me how the movie is in many ways an allegory for the gospel. And I was stunned because, you know, at first glance, you see a skull and you think, oh, you know, death.
This can't go well.
We don't want to go in that direction. But as an art teacher, I've really opened up to listening first and passing judgment later, and or not passing judgment, leaving judgment to the Lord. My name, Danielle, means God is my judge. So I have to remember that God is everyone else's
no
judge
pressure. What a great example.
Before thinking you know why someone is drawn to whatever it is they're drawn to.
100%. I mean, it reminds me of, we talk a little bit on this podcast before, we've talked in the past about Tim Keller's formulation, plus minus plus. You know, when you're talking to somebody, you're dealing with somebody and you're trying to make it a gospel-centered conversation or whatever, or even in your work, the plus is, you know, what are you talking about that I can agree with or I can hang with? The minus side is the stuff, well, I can't hang with that. I can hang with the first part, but I can't hang with that part. And then the other plus is how is Jesus' way better or more effective or more beautiful or whatever it might be. So it kind of reminds me of that. We're looking for the raw material in those other stories and even in the images. And that's where it gets tricky, right? Images and the Christian church, it's an interesting, long history back and forth about imagery, imagination, and all that stuff. Maybe you can touch on that a little bit. I don't know if you've encountered any of that in your thinking.
Sure. I used to joke that whenever I was teaching at a Christian school at CCS or where I currently am, I would have to have a talk with my students about, I love work that's about the Bible. I love work that's about Jesus. But please don't feel that it's going to deeply please me every time you draw 3 crosses on a hill, right? Like this, I see, and or even, you know, a cross, a dove, symbols that we use in
clear Christian symbols
in our faith, you know, to connect to other ideas, but to really value and create new ways of thinking and seeing and experiencing our faith and sharing it with others, I think is really important.
It makes it authentic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is what people, I think, are looking for, right? I mean, authenticity in that and the way it interacts with culture is what I'm thinking as you're talking about that, you know, because some of those would have almost become tropes, if I can use that sort of language, then it's become so overcommon that we've determined that's really the only way you can do this. So this kind of hyper-representational kind of viewpoint, and that's not necessarily the thing that's going to connect while still staying centered on the truth. We'll talk about that in a minute, but what do you think about that thought?
Yeah, I don't think that that's what's going to connect you with a non-believer for sure.
But
it's also not the most effective thing for connecting with and stimulating the hearts and minds of Christians who have seen those things a million times before, or it can feel tired, and it can feel sometimes like a commercial or like instead of the song that's playing on the radio that you want to hear that someone today wrote and you connect with, it takes you out of the contemporary moment. And not that we certainly don't want to mimic or emulate contemporary culture. I think I've heard about the, what were they called? You'll have to help me, Tom. The band from the early 2000s, the all worship music started to sound like Mumford and Sons.
There we go.
Mumford and Sons effect, right? Where we find success, in this one style, and then the church says, "Oh, let me get some of that." But instead, my goal as an art educator is to train and raise a generation of Christians, creative Christian artists who are capable of creating culturally significant works from the ground up, not in the context of I'm in the church and I'm going to copy or be the knockoff version of this movie or this video game or this song.
It seems like the Christian community in general has been really good about copying things and kind of Christianizing them in a sense, which I think a lot of people now, and I'm not saying it's all bad, there are some positive things about that, but there's also this sense in which you kind of lose a lot of people today because it doesn't seem particularly authentic, doesn't seem particularly genuine, and it seems, frankly, just you're taking the low-hanging fruit and you're not really working at it. And that's what I think working with artists like you're doing, what I love about what you're doing is you're saying to young artists, you have to have a craft. There's a craft here. It's not just a matter of, I've done the symbol or I've done the representational thing and now I'm finished because it's obviously true. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, nothing wrong with it, but if we stay there and we don't grow into a deeper understanding, maybe that's what we're saying. We probably should take a look at that.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. So let me dive into something since we're already in a little bit of deep water because we want to bring it back to the end and talk about some specific things that folks who work with kids or young people or college-age students can do to help people be more creative. But before we do that, I want to just talk a minute about this quote that I hear a lot in the things, some of the things that I read, which says, "Beauty saves the world." You hear that quote a lot. Now, maybe if you don't read certain things, you'll never hear it, but it's out there. It's out there a lot. So I'm going to ask you, put you on the spot here. Do you think that beauty can save the world, really?
I believe that because beauty, my definition of beauty, is that it must be rooted in the truth and the goodness of God. And that it is something that then inspires us to wonder about what could be, what would on earth as it is in heaven look like. And in that vein, I do believe that beauty can save the world.
So it's the capital B beauty that's behind the small b beauty, if you can say it that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Kelly, from your perspective, kind of like when you think as a mom and you're thinking about, do you ever think, for example, we haven't rehearsed this, by the way, but have you ever thought about, do you teach your kids about what beauty is? Do you talk about beauty as much as you do about truth, or how do you relate those two?
It's interesting because the world presents so much seemingly beautiful things that I feel like, we really have to ask the question, is this really beautiful?
Yeah.
And so, I find that I'm looking for the truth in the beauty.
Yeah. Which I think is what we're all saying. I think that's true. But Danielle, you have something to thought about that?
Well, I thought about that with my own kids for a moment, and I just had a beautiful moment with my daughter the other day where I realized that, and some of it's just my language as an art educator. I'm constantly identifying beauty and modeling appreciation of things that I find beautiful. But we were in the grocery store the other day and she walked by just this, like a perfectly ordered row of carrots and stopped and said, "That is beautiful."
Wow.
And I felt so proud of just the ability to slow down, stop. And I don't know what it was about the order of these carrots that just struck her. But I saw, a little bit of artist heart there, seeking out and taking that moment to stop and recognize and call attention to include me in the moment of seeing something beautiful. And, you know, it can be a sunset or a row of carrots.
Yeah.
But I think that is something I wish, I hope, I work toward Christians being known as people who are able to do that, just second nature, find beauty, recognize beauty, share the beauty with others.
I love the carrot example. I think it's an awesome example. That is a beautiful example.
It really is.
You know, it really is. And so, which reminds me, you know, like if we put a title on this episode and we say, this episode is about beauty, or this episode is about creativity in some fashion or the other, there are a lot of people who would intentionally probably not tune in. Because back to the definitional issues, like for them, beauty, maybe culturally, because when the culture talks about beauty, it's almost always, I think, physical. Am I wrong? I mean, it's mostly, it's like, this is a beautiful person. What?
And attainable. Personally
and attainable. Right, exactly. And I think what we're saying is beauty is actually a much broader term, way beyond just whether or not a person is attractive or whatever. And I think that, and so when we think of creativity, we tend to think of the arts. When in reality, there's a lot of many sectors and many fields where creativity is extremely important. Engineers, very, very important to be creative in certain ways. And entrepreneurs, lots of creativity. And now it's usually in a certain channel or whatever, but it's still very creative because you're taking two things, often creativity. I heard somebody describe creativity. You're taking a couple different things and you're putting them together in a way that really hasn't been done before. And you've gotten something new out of that. Now we know there's nothing new under the sun and all that, but fundamentally you're getting something that's different out of it. So anyway, all that to say, I think if we can help even in our conversation today, say, hey, let's broaden the conversation a little bit about beauty. There's a lot of beautiful things that goes beyond nature and carrots and people, but there are a lot of other things, order in general, you know. What do you think? What do you think about the idea that there's beauty in pain?
In pain?
Or suffering?
Absolutely, there's beauty in pain.
Okay, so that's a whole different vibe, right? How do you think those two things relate?
I think, you know, Makoto Fujimura says it better than I do, but he talks about how in Japanese culture, like the most beautiful thing is this idea of sacrifice, of giving of oneself, which is a very deeply Christian thought or idea, principle. And I think that, I mean, I would almost even argue that it is difficult to experience beauty without experiencing some kind of pain. As fallen, you know, as sinful people, I think that all beauty, when we really experience it deeply, causes us to long for heaven, to long for difference, to long for things to be better than they are. Even, you know, I've heard you talk on the podcast a lot about like human love being placed on the highest pedestal, oftentimes culturally. And even in that situation, there's a pain and a vulnerability to, I'm willing to give so much of myself, to have this sacrifice to be in a relationship. So yeah, pain is, you know, and as an art educator, as a Christian art educator, what becomes difficult is helping students navigate that line of, okay, when are we trying to attribute the beauty to the pain instead of attributing the beauty to the truth or the sacrifice. And that, I mean, that's the kind of work I spend, I think, the most time with my students on sussing out, wait a second, what is this really about? What are you,
that's a great
what are you
point.
making and what is it about?
I think the world does that a lot. That it attributes pain to beauty, and I think that would be for you a hard job to kind of steer the students away from that, because you see that in all types of art or creativity. And like secular schools, they would push the students towards that. I like what you're doing though, is you're kind of bringing like a self-awareness to the kids and bringing it back to the Lord, really, because when you were saying earlier, when you get into that, I forgot how you phrased it, maybe that Zen, moment.
Oh, flow.
The flow.
Yeah.
When you get into the flow, you can bring that back to Christ, and it can really be a beautiful thing. It's almost like working through the pain to bring it back right back to Him, and while you're in the flow.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Well, and you had us read in our first year of Latour, we read Francis A. Schaeffer's Art and the Bible. And a concept that has stuck with me that I use with students all the time is the idea that though individual works of art you make over the course of your life may not be individually obviously God honoring or bringing glory to God, the idea is that as a Christian, your life's work, your body of work, the journey that your creative process and artworks take should ultimately be redemptive and should, not only reflect your own working out your salvation, but also, how you're engaging with an audience and trying to bring them into that experience with you. That's been a helpful resource.
Yeah,
I love it.
that's just so great.
I like
love
that imagery of working out your salvation through your art.
Yeah, and so in a way, maybe we can summarize this section by saying, in some ways, the point is not the pain. That's not the central point. I mean, it's real, and it requires lamentation. It requires entering into the space and acknowledging that it's real and not just trying to blow it off. All of those things, but so maybe I'm just experimenting with this idea. So maybe part of the beauty is in acknowledging the reality of this pain.
The truth of it.
Yeah, and the truth of it.
Yeah.
Because it's real.
Yeah.
And then the next part of the beauty really is your point, Kelly, where you start to turn back to Christ, and it's the healing of that brokenness.
Yeah, healing's a good word. It is healing.
Yeah, there's a healing to it. And I think that's the part, and circle back what we were talking about at the beginning of this section. If all you do is focus on, well, art is supposed to be, I'll use this term guardedly, but ugly, because life is ugly. And in order for it to be real and true, it has to just reflect that cultural mess and brokenness. It's an interesting question because there's, in a sense in which, there is a value in art representing cultural moments, but without some place for hope somewhere, then you begin to go, well, we're recording it and we're saying, yeah, it's horrible. But then what?
Yeah,
and so that's a tricky thing.
It has to have a transcendent quality,
or
we don't care about it. I mean, all art has to take us to another, I would call it maybe even like a spiritual plane or some place where and it can either transport us to a place in our hearts that is more like heaven or less like heaven. And
that's good. So we're coming towards the end, but I want to get one more quick thing in here, and that is we talked a little bit about what people can do on purpose to help elicit creativity. And one of those things would be some of the stuff we've talked about already, and just basically allowing questions and allowing kids to formulate those questions and sometimes to sit in the questions, which is great. So I have a theory. I have a lot of theories, and I'm not sure how many are actually true, but hopefully some of them are. So what do you think about the use of silence as a way for people to begin to access some of that? What do you think about that concept?
I think I would connect silence with contemplation, and say that prayerful contemplation, unmixed attention that I would say is prayer, helps us prepare our hearts and our minds for creative work. So, or academic work, which can be creative too. But I think we have so many students who want to listen to music while they work, or have a show going on in the background. And even the popular, Marie Kondo's Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, she advocates for, when you're doing this work, don't put on music. It should be silent. You need to hear yourself. You need to be able to experience, your own thoughts. And I would say also leave a little bit of space for the Holy Spirit in your creative work.
Right.
Yeah, I think silence is a great tool.
Right. And I think, so in a classroom setting, for example, just getting super practical, in a classroom setting, sometimes just allowing kids to ask questions and have a discussion around those questions without always having to have a perfect answer. And that's what I call sitting in the question, or having streams of questions. But then also, it could be something as simple as when a kid is trying to figure something out and you've asked a question, just allowing silence, time for silence in the classroom to let them think and explore in their own mind, what's actually going on. Those are super obvious maybe for some folks, but practical, but they don't happen a lot in classrooms. All the space is filled.
Yeah, it's that shift from product to process, from I'm going to ask you a question, and when I ask you the question, you need to immediately give me the correct answer, versus I'm going to ask you a question, and I expect that it's going to be difficult for you to come up with the answer. So I'm going to give you some time to think about it, figure it out. Maybe if it's a good question, I don't know the answer to it. So we might both need a minute to contemplate.
Yeah, I think I had the reputation when I was a regular teacher a lot that I asked a lot of questions. And I think, some people are like, wow, where do you get all those questions? Like, I don't know, I just think of them. And I don't always know the answer to them too, but it's kind of fun talking about it and trying to figure it out, So that's part of the joy of education to me is actually that. It's not just the regurgitation of information at all. That information is important because you have to have something to think about. But at the end of the day, just that connection with teachers and students and what that feels like and what that looks like in kind of a dynamic way that allows us to explore that, I think that's like gold to me anyway.
It's the best. It's
it really is. That's what like teaching is supposed to be about, I think. So, well, boy, I mean, the time has gone super fast.
I know, it really has.
So
we'd love to have you back on sometime.
I think we need to do that because there's a whole nother group of things that we'd love to unpack with you, Danielle. But I tell you, I just love the way you frame a lot of these concepts. Clearly, you've done a lot of thinking about this. You've studied this, and that's why it's been such a joy, And I know this is real because I know you, and I know this is real from your heart.
Yeah.
So that's a really cool and awesome thing. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much for having me. I was looking forward to it so much, and I'm so ready to do it again.
All right, very good. And we are grateful for all of you guys tuning in and watching today. It's been a real treat having you. And remember, if you forget everything else that we said today, remember, Jesus Christ is Lord. Take care. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Gospel Centered Education Podcast, brought to you by Community Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida. You can find us online at myccs.org.